led our ancestors during the Protestant Reformation to question the sacred scriptures and the organization of church. And they started asking questions, and asking, they noticed the incongruity of scripture, and they noticed the incongruity of faith leaders' actions related to that scripture. And they found that by asking the questions, they moved deeper and started understanding the deeper and more nuanced understandings of life. Being able to question is a fundamental part of our growth as individuals and as a society. I think younger children, especially like in that 3 to 7, 8 range, have an innate sense of wonder, and they are very skilled at asking questions. But often, sometimes as we get a little older, we get a little shy about asking questions because we're afraid how we might be judged in asking those. A major part of our role as people of faith is to create a space or a community that allows people to ask questions, that allows them to explore new truths in a free and responsible way. Asking questions can be hard, and sometimes they come up at inconvenient times, like when you're trying to put a child to bed and they won't stop asking questions, or when you're in the middle of some process and somebody asks a question that seems unrelated. But the point is that questions, even when they come at inconvenient times, are very useful. And we also know, and we've experienced this, that I think in our society recently, is that sometimes questions now are being often used as a weapon, as a way of criticism or ridicule. Instead of really having the intent of learning, they have intent of being weaponized. Still, there is wisdom in the question. In my mind, asking questions is a most precious skill and an ongoing skill for all of us to continue to develop. We live in a world that is driven by facts and statistics, and we are all too aware of how often information is used or manipulated to a particular perspective. And so it's important that we continue to ask questions, even of information and data that we receive, because if we leave it unchallenged, it often goes as truth, or parades as truth, which we know is not always true. Even in science, we find that questions play an important role of creating a hypothesis and then trying to prove or disprove that hypothesis. It's something that's important to our spiritual growth and our development. It's important to our social justice work. It's important to interpersonal relationships. Asking questions is a necessary thing if we are to be kind, loving, and compassionate with ourselves and others. So today, in honor of the spiritual practice of asking questions, I will be responding to questions from the congregation related to topics of faith, religion, Unitarian Universalism, and ministry. Please keep in mind that these responses are mine and not necessarily the view of all Unitarian Universalists or even all of the people in this congregation. They are my reflections based on my own studies, life experience, exploration, and spiritual development. So with that, I'm going to take a deep breath and get ready for Phyllis to ask our first question. We need to unmute you. That helps too.
We've got at least 3 questions here in the chat, but we had the original one that Melanie Craig sent me by email, which was about suffering. How do we deal with the experience of suffering, and how do we help with the experience of suffering of others? So do you want to tackle that one first?
And that's like a whole sermon series right there.
Yeah. So do you want me to run through all the questions and then you can kind of pace yourself?
No, I'm just going to try and take them as they come.
Okay. All right. There's the first one.
So suffering. Suffering is a part of life. It's an awkward part of life for many of us. It is a part of life that holds within it the potential for great learning. It is also holds with it a potential for devastation. One of the things that I have found really powerful in studying mindfulness meditation and Buddhism is that, that's kind of what Buddha's philosophy and ministry and teachings were all about, is living with suffering, how to be with suffering, and developing the skills to reduce suffering in the world. And I think that the way that we learn to reduce suffering is greatly to work with ourselves and notice the ways that we can be oppressive and that we can cause suffering. Also notice how the causes and conditions of our society, how we treat people, how we create legislation, things like that, cause suffering or harm to other people, and work towards trying to reduce that harm. And then finally, again, the work within ourselves of trying to identify and name suffering and learn how to work with it in a way that we don't carry that suffering on. Often when we get treated poorly, we're agitated and we turn that suffering into snapping at somebody else or being mean to somebody else, not necessarily intentionally, but it's part of our autonomic response to suffering. And we create more suffering. So being able to end that cycle, I think, is a big part of, for me, my faith. And the ability to also let go of suffering and pay attention to it, but not cling on to it. And one of the equations that I learned in my mindfulness training, which I find really profound, is that suffering, if you can imagine the equation in your mind, suffering equals pain, and pain is something that's real. We experience pain as human beings, it's real. But suffering equals pain times resistance. The more that we resist pain, the more suffering we experience, and the more suffering that we create in the world. So that's my answer for that.
So onto a similar theme, perhaps. Linda Sisson writes in, I'd like some help with forgiveness. How do I forgive people who have hurt me or others? And how do I forgive myself?
A lot of the work, I'm trying to remember the name of the author and psychologist, but a lot of the work that is being talked about now in the theological realm around forgiveness is that forgiveness is really something that is a big part of what we give ourselves, that we can sometimes go to ask other people if we've done something, of recognizing we've done something wrong and ask for their forgiveness, but that true forgiveness is really something that we cultivate within our own heart. And I think some of that has to do with being able to be kind and compassionate with ourselves and recognize that we are not perfect, that we make mistakes, and that forgiveness is an opportunity for us to grow and to move on. The clinging that I talked about earlier, often when we are stuck and we can't forgive, we can't move on, is related to our own holding on to something or somebody else holding on to something that allows us to remain in a cycle of suffering. And so in the Jewish tradition of Teshuvah, there's a saying that basically if you go to somebody and you ask them for forgiveness and they refuse, because people use that sometimes as a power trip, a power over people, right? Because we hold, I'm not going to forgive you. That's unconscionable. I could never forgive you for that, blah, blah, blah. that if you go and you ask that person 3 times, the 3rd time, if they refuse, then it's considered that that forgiveness has still been offered. You've genuinely tried, and that continues to be refused. But it's time to let go of that power of the person over you. And I think that that's the big piece of forgiveness for me is doing the work. And forgiveness is not the same thing as forgetting. We can still remember harm that has been caused by ourselves or by other people, and we can still hold people accountable. But if we continue to dwell on that and not offer some level of forgiveness, we are unable to move on. And so there are multiple ways that we can work for forgiveness. Spiritual practice is a great way. Psychotherapy is often a great way. And sometimes just depending on your relationship with yourself or with the person who you're feeling the harm with, just having a conversation, a healing conversation can also be helpful. So I hope that answers that question, and maybe a little more.
All right. Our 3rd question is from Linda and Rissa. How do we, as UUs, who affirm the inherent worth and dignity in every person as our first principle, how do we maintain that in reference to people who actively work to deny rights to others or oppress others? I struggle with holding on to this principle when I think about some people.
Yeah, I think that that is very difficult, and I won't name names, but we've had many examples in our recent history of individuals who have not allowed for people to be who they are, and to allow people to be fully themselves, and tried to single people out or to demonize people. And this is a challenging thing, and I think our Universalist ancestors would say that we still recognize their inherent worth and dignity. I think that our ancestors, along with people like Martin Luther King Jr. and Gandhi, would say that we still can love them, and that it's important that we also hold people accountable, and that we find ways to not allow those things to happen, and send a very clear message that that's not acceptable. And when we're able to, yesterday at the Social Justice Committee retreat, we had a really powerful conversation about how do you talk to somebody who is spewing hatred or spewing things, untruths, or things that are harmful. And I think the work that we can do as individuals is to build our resilience up a little bit, so that we can try to sit and listen, and listen beneath the rhetoric, listen beneath all the crap and the horrific things that people are saying, and trying to understand what lies beneath that. And I also think that there are some times that there are some people who are so caught up in an ideology that sometimes it's might be almost impossible to have the conversation, at least now. But if we, are able to build some kind of relationship, there might be hope. And even if we're not, I think that there are ways that, especially in democracy, and why democracy is so important, is democracy allows us to still hold people accountable. Not necessarily having to agree. And we can still, on a spiritual level, try to recognize their inherent worth and dignity. And I would say that that is not always easy. That is a thing that challenges many of us in our faith.
Jody has another question that's perhaps a little similar to that.
Hmm.
How do we relate to the evangelicals who see our country and want our country to return to Christianity? The Constitution says we have freedom of religion.
Mm-hmm. And I think that is an area of continued importance as far as building relationship and trying to learn a little bit more about evangelicalism, because I think, again, it's an area where there's a lot of misconception. And I also think that by finding ways of connecting, I know I've had several instances where I just seem to bump into people in crowds, and I get to talking about religion and people who identify themselves as evangelicals. And I think many of them are people of faith, and because of their life experiences or whatnot, find that particular mode of faith something that is very meaningful to them. And what I found sometimes is in those conversations, they're surprised to find that a Unitarian Universalist minister might also be spiritual and might also hold some values that are similar to them. If you remember, Unitarian Universalism has come out of Christianity. Our parents were Christian. And so looking for ways that we have certain values that overlap, and also being able to recognize spaces where we don't necessarily agree. And I think the biggest challenge for us is that I think part of many evangelical traditions is the proselytizing, the trying to convert people to a particular viewpoint, a particular faith, and also an unquestioning faith, which for me is a little hard sometimes to relate to. But I also know several people who that level of focus and structure is actually very beneficial. And so it's a different way of approaching faith. So I don't know if I'm fully answered that question. I don't have a bulleted list there, but I think the big part is doing what we do. And I think sometimes as Unitarian Universalists, we're shy about being out in the public sphere, talking about religion, being fully UU. We tend to see spirituality as being something that's very individualistic. We don't always like to show up with our UU identity. And evangelicals are actually very good at doing that. And so maybe that's another way that we can show that there are other ways to approach faith that are equally as valuable and equally as important and equally as soul-saving and nourishing as other forms of faith.
We have one more. Do you have time for one more?
I think we do. Yeah, we'll do one more.
So from Sue Henry Mackenzie, what do we as UUs think of life after death? I don't know if, Sue, that means that you are asking whether UUs believe in heaven, but you phrased it so that you're curious about how UUs think about life after death, either what it's going to be or whether it even is there. Right.
And I would say that the answer to your question is yes. As Unitarian Universalist, I think we have a variety of perspectives on what happens when we die. There are people who are very clear that in their thinking that when we die, that's just it. Our body decomposes and That's it, feeds new life. And that is all she wrote. There are others who believe that there's a way that when our bodies decompose and feed the plants and animals around us, that we're kind of rejuvenating and contributing to the ongoing presence of life on Earth and the solar system. There are folks who also believe that there is a sense of our spirit, our essence, the way that we affect people, the way that we connect with people, the way that we touch each other's lives and memories and thoughts continue to live on in our hearts and memories and thoughts. And then we also have people who are very clear that there is something that happens after life, whether we become reincarnated, whether we go to heaven or another abode, but there's another level of existence. And I think that those to me are the ones that I'm the most familiar with in Unitarian Universalist circles, but I think that if you talk to your fellow UUSB members and Unitarian Universalists, you'll find that there may be some other perspectives as well. But as a movement, as a denomination, we don't have any set teaching or understanding of what that means. I know it's interesting for me as I think one of the most deeply, profoundly meaningful things that I get to do as a minister is memorial services, and it's an incredible honor to be welcomed into places where people are suffering, people are grieving, and people are trying to make sense of a person's death, even though it's something that happens to us all. It's still something that is profound and very spiritual. And so one of the things I find just really interesting is not only learning about the deceased, but also being able to engage in just really basic, raw conversation with people about how they want their loved one remembered, how they connect with that loved one, and what meaning they make of that person's loss and death. So, yeah, there's a lot there.
I think we're at our end.
Okay, great. Well, thank you all for those wonderful questions. And keep asking them, keep asking each other questions, keep asking yourself questions as together in community we search for the answers. And now invite you to join in singing our closing hymn.
Something
As we extinguish our Unitarian Universalist chalice flame, symbol of faith, hope, love, and connection, and our desire for answers to questions both knowable and knowable, let us be reminded that although our time of worship has come to an end, our time for service to each other and to the world has just begun. Blessed be. I invite you now to join in singing our benediction. Thank you again for joining us this morning, for your questions and thoughts and joys and sorrows. A special thanks to all the people who contributed to bringing our service together this morning. And we hope that you will join us again and again and again. We are now going to ask if you want to stay for our coffee hour, to please stay on the Zoom call. And if you are in a spot where you need to get on with your day, if you could log off right now so that we can divvy up our rooms with not having empty spots in them.